All right. We're going to come back together. We are at 10:30. Okay, thank you for it's good energy and good conversation. I appreciate you pausing that for a little bit. We are grateful to have Scot Marion for the Center of Assessment here with us today. We're appreciative of him being able to come into Utah. He's a very busy person. Their company is very busy. As you guys know, assessment's a big deal all over the country, not just here in Utah, and there's lots of challenges. And so I'm going to turn the time over to him, and we'll be together until 11:30.
So there's a lot of familiar faces. A lot of you I haven't met before. I think I've probably been working on Utah assessments longer than anyone in the room. We started as a company working in Utah in 2003. I always joke that those condominiums right next door were just a parking lot when I started. I should have bought one because it would have saved me a lot of hotel money. But it's good to be here. We have the APAC this afternoon, and for those of you who don't know, we've worked with the state and among many states that we work with on assessment and accountability issues. We coordinate the technical advisory committee meeting that helps ensure some of the stuff that people are worried about these transitions between various assessments. This grew out of a set of emails and conversations with Robert, actually, about local interest in measuring student growth, particularly in the grades and subjects where you don't have a SAGE test and the student growth percentiles. So I'm going to sort of, instead of just saying, here, use this formula, this formula, this formula, I'm going to do a little bit of grounding first, just to help, because it's easy, like I said earlier, the computer doesn't care if it's the new science or the old science, and it'll always spit out a number, but it's up to us to figure out what that number means. And then most importantly, depending on the use, if you're using it for anything at the aggregate level for holding teachers accountable or anything like that, then the inferences that you are going to make and the attribution that you're going to provide is a really big deal, and there's so much more that can go wrong than can go right, I'm afraid to say. And so we have to think about these things in advance. I'll go through some of this intro stuff fast because I know people will have a lot of questions. This colleague, former colleague, is actually the founding board member. The center's a not-for-profit. He was one of the founding board members, Dale Carlson, the founding board chair, as California assessment director for years, and one of my mentors. I wrote this fabulously simple and straightforward paper in 2002 about characterizing, in this case it was school performance. How do we think about school performance? And is that people generally have two main questions. How good is this school, and is the school getting better? And then we could break those down further. We say, how good is this school? People ask questions about achievement. How high are kids achieving? And then this effectiveness question is a biggie. And he did this, he wrote this actually just as we were starting to learn how to evaluate and monitor student longitudinal growth. And then given the achievement of the kids when they enter, how much did they develop or grow when they are in school? And that's what a lot of us care about. The other thing, this is a big, for those of you involved in continuous improvement or systems change, these questions are really the tricky one, this B. Is the quality or effectiveness of the school improving? So not only is the school adding value to the kid, but is the school continuing to accelerate that pace of being able to do that? That's really the holy grail of school improvement, right? By the way, Emily has these slides, and she's, I think, sending them out right now. So you don't have to take too many notes. But that's a great paper. It's a short read, and it helped ground you in a lot of stuff. And he did it in this nice 2x2 matrix of achievement and effectiveness. And this change, right, that's where we look at percent proficient across years. We had 60% of our kids proficient this year. We're at 65% in the next year. So that's a 5% change. People say that's better than a negative 5%. Does it mean anything? But we really care about this one a lot today. Given where the kids are at, are they improving? I'm going to keep moving this. Right, so this is at the school level. Is this an effective school? So given where the kids are at, you would say, looks like Lincoln's a better school or more effective school than Washington. Kids are on a steeper trajectory. So this is a tricky one. This is that continuous improvement model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but this is this, given the change from year to year in the kids, is the level of change increasing? And that's really what we want to see in a lot of schools. So this grew out of this conversation about student growth. And there's no question that this in Dale's quadrant C, the focus on student growth has increased dramatically over the last, I would say, 15 years. I was going to say 10 originally, and then I realized I'm getting older too. So it really has been about 15 years. And a lot of this came with the advent of continuous data from 3 through 8 through No Child Left Behind that had that availability. A lot of the interim assessment providers like NWA and STAR, Renaissance STAR, were doing this before the No Child Left Behind era. And people were just sort of dabbling in it originally. And then a lot of statisticians, psychometricians, economists really started taking it very seriously in the early 2000s. And obviously, most of this work focuses on grades and subjects where you have 2 consecutive years, 3rd grade reading, 4th grade reading. But this is Chris, I want you to spend some time thinking about, why do you even want to calculate student growth? Right? At the end, we talked about this with accountability systems. Many argue student growth, focusing on student growth, as Darren said, that is increased in importance in the accountability system, is really important for 3 through 8. And it's not unimportant in high school, but by the end of high school, it's great if a kid is growing, but they have to be able to do something by the time they leave high school. So you're just squeezing the time frame down, right? But there's different uses. Do we want to report this to parents or to the kids themselves? That's one thing. Is it information for teachers to use about individual kids or aggregations of their classes? Do we want to use it for educator evaluation purposes? Or in some of your bigger districts, do you want to use it for school accountability purposes beyond what the state provides already? And so the response makes a big difference. And I'll show you just one example. If we say that we want to do this to improve student learning, we have to think about the theory of action. How is reporting student growth going to change what happens, change those interactions between teachers and kids, or between parents and schools, depending on your theory of action, or vice versa, right? And I'm not saying it doesn't, but simply hoping that it will is a bad theory of action, right? And so how do you have to report the information? How do you have to be able to break the information down to people so they can use it in a way that can actually lead to improvements? Many of you were here when there was, and it's still ongoing, we're still wrestling with it, there was the emphasis with school grading that there had to be, instead of a growth percentile or something like that, there had to be a scale score target reported at the beginning of every year that would describe each kid's growth target for that year. And it's fine, they didn't like having it in a percentile, but I kept asking, do teachers know how hard they need to teach to increase a scale score by 6 points versus 8 points versus 10 points? I don't think so, right? So, I mean, I tried hard to get people to think about that theory of action, but those are the kinds of exercises you have to go through to think about this stuff. So one of the things, if your goal is, and this is, we were just talking about the KEEP assessment, but if your goal is to report information that can help parents understand where kids are at and what they might need to do next, this is truly the holy grail of growth modeling, is this notion of content reference growth. So it's not saying that, you know, I grew 6 points, but I was actually now able to do these things that I couldn't do before, whether it's add fractions with, unlike denominators, and successfully do that, and use that to be able to solve mathematical problems. When I came into the class, I didn't even know about fractions. So that would be content referencing that people, nice to see, this is a learning progression in language arts, in identifying author's purpose. Now, it's hard to aggregate that for larger purposes beyond reporting. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of that this is easier, it's true, it's easier in early elementary. We have really good ideas of how people progress through domains in K3, K4 literacy, and K3 math or so. We're getting better at it. One place where the Common Core standards have helped, they've outlined some of these big ideas. And so this is, if your goal though is to say, I want to report growth in order to help parents understand where kids are at, we do have studies that show that the parents actually resonate with this kind of information much better than scale scores. So aggregate growth is why a lot of us are here. As a guy I used to work with in Wyoming, he used to always say, there's a simple solution to every complex problem, except it's wrong. Right? And this is a hard thing to do. So, for instance, teaching and school quality are very complex constructs. They're not captured by a single score. We do work with policy bodies, and I was in a neighboring state. You neighbor a lot of states, so I won't embarrass the state, but you could. And the state senator said, we're talking about teacher evaluation. He says, you just give the kids a test at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, and you see how effective the teacher was. And I said, I didn't think of that. I didn't know it was that easy. And so, but that's, a lot of people, you know this, you deal with this, right? That's intuitively a very popular notion. And if that's all that teaching quality was, how a kid did on a 50-item test in the beginning of the year and the end of the year, that would be a pretty easy way to characterize this. We know it's way more complex. And school quality is much more complex than that. So when we think about this aggregate growth for accountability, the way that I've been thinking about this for years, and it was interesting, when I started putting these slides together, I feel like I've talked about this before. We at the center got involved in kicking and screaming, involved in teacher evaluation work. We actually said this is the third rail of educational accountability. We didn't want to be involved with it, but then in a lot of our states, Colorado was really the first one, applying for Race to the Top funds, and they said we need help. And actually my thinking was we can't be any worse than what I'm seeing out there. And we actually did make some contributions, I think. We did work here with the growth subcommittee of the teacher evaluation task force here, and lots of other states. And so I was going through some slides, and I said I hadn't touched this stuff in a while because, as you know, with the passage of ESSA, federally required teacher evaluations sort of fallen by the wayside. A lot of states are saying, well, maybe this is a local issue. But we've done a lot of thinking about this, and people often want to rush to one of these things. I got 2 tests, I could do this. So they just focus on the measures. I just got to get tests. Hillsborough County, Florida was notorious for that. They developed something like 431 end-of-course tests. It's a district of 200,000 kids, so it's not small. They developed like 431 end-of-course tests so that they could do teacher evaluation. And the question I actually asked the assistant superintendent, so what are you going to do next year? Right? these tests will, if they're used for high stakes, we have lots of evidence that people will figure out what's on those tests. A lot of people want to rush to the analysis question. It says, I know subtraction. I don't even need a more complex calculator than a 4-function calculator. Or I know regression. I could do fancy analyses on this. The thing that people often forget about is this notion of attribution. And in the world of experimental design or research, we often think about causal attribution. Because if I'm saying that, Robert had, an average score of 50 in his class and Darren had an average score of 30, Robert is a better teacher. I'm making a causal inference that might or might not be supported, and likely not in that case, right? So we need all these things to work together. So I'm going to just go through these. So what are people doing, particularly in the grades where you don't have state testing? A lot of people are using commercial interim assessments or even the SAGE interim assessments, but not in the subjects that you don't have them, things like social studies and things like that. Many are using state or particularly district-created end-of-course tests and filling it. Hillsborough County one is an exaggeration. It's not an exaggeration, it's real, but not many other people did, districts did stuff like that. A lot of people are focusing on either school-developed or teacher-developed measures of student performance, and that was certainly the case with things like student learning objectives and other measures like that. Some people are relying on norm reference tests. You tend not to find those outside of the content areas where you already have SAGE tests. You just might find them at grade levels like K1, 2, and things like that. What else are people seeing as measures where there's an interest in calculating growth beyond these categories? Any others? It's a pretty broad sweep, right? So assessment quality does matter. And my company's the Center for Assessment. I can't not say that, but it makes less of a difference than some of the other stuff. It's still important. Don't say, Scott from the Center for Assessment said assessment quality doesn't matter. Assessment quality matters, but that's one necessary but very far from sufficient condition for this. Potential analytical approaches, right? So people are playing with lots of different things. And for those of you in the small districts compared to the large districts, you have very different opportunities and challenges. So it's not necessarily that the large districts have an advantage or the small districts have an advantage. You get to do different things. If you're a really small district, just, stick a piece of paper on the kid's back and follow around and just keep track of what they've learned, right? In a big district, you can't do that, too many kids. But you have opportunities to employ those large numbers to do some things statistically that others can't. So people are developing, I should have quotes around growth models, using either pre-test and post-test scores like fall to spring, or scores like spring to spring on a vertical scale. That's a common thing. Value-added models, I don't know many locals who are doing value-added modeling unless they're working with an outside agency, often a university or somebody like that. But that often could be done with either a pre-score and a post-test score in the same subject, or you could condition, I'll talk more about this conditioning, on data from something beyond other than a pre-test score, like last year's tests. Student growth percentiles. Many of you are familiar with student growth percentiles. We'll still talk about them, though. They can be used. Some people are doing this shared attribution. I don't spend a lot of time talking about this. This is the case where I have my SAGE results, and I have the student growth percentiles from SAGE results for language arts and math, and I'm going to say that everybody in the school shares in these. And that was a fairly common approach in the teacher evaluation world. And so I've actually heard it in certain cases. It was you as a non-language arts or math teacher could pick if you wanted to be associated with the math teachers or the language arts teachers. I mean, it was like Survivor SGP. I mean, it was like, who are you going to vote for, right? And so So, or worse, rolling the dice, right? To figure out who would, as a phys ed teacher, should I bet on the English teachers or the math teachers? But that's common still. People say, and I understand that it's really becomes a school accountability measure, and all the teachers just sort of share in that school accountability. And then student learning objectives, which I've done a lot of work and a lot of writing on student learning objectives. I think they're a great instructional improvement tool. There's a lot of challenges with the measurement approaches to it. Depends on how you view and your use cases. I'm going to talk in more detail about these various analytic approaches, and feel free to stop me for questions at any time. Okay. So this is the common approach, right? It's either based on expected changes from a pre-test to a post-test, and it makes a lot of sense. People say, I want to see what the kids know in the beginning, I want to see what they know at the end. It's and so we think that the gains provide a pretty straightforward approach to saying, what did the kids learn in this course? Now you could imagine, right? So there's two ways to do it. You could say, I'm going to give them the same exact test in the fall as the spring, or I'm going to give them a different test in the fall than the spring. And there's advantages and disadvantages of each one. So if I administer the same test twice, right, it's easy to see the improvement between the tests. And let's assume that nobody cheats and steals the test, and right, let's put that one aside. And you only need one test, right? So there might be some disadvantage that some kids might have actually paid attention to the pre-test and might remember the test items in the spring. There's a big danger in the teacher focusing on those test items exclusively, if that's what I'm being held accountable. And if all they could do is that test, I might lose this notion of generalizability. Can they do this in more than one circumstance? The challenge with two different tests is the difficulty of, it's hard, as the folks at USBE who work on test development tell you, it's really hard to write two tests with the same level of difficulty. And that's why we use statistics to help us put tests on the same scale. You need more than one test, obviously. There's some advantages. There's greater, you could use the fall test as a formative tool as well to help guide your teaching, and potentially some claims for generalizability. The challenge, though, is finding a pretest that actually makes sense. If it's a subject, I taught high school science, and I taught biology and chemistry, and I remember thinking that, well, after the fact, I remember thinking at the time that the biggest impediment to kids learning chemistry well was mastery of proportional reasoning, 5th, 6th, 7th grade math, and they're taking 11th grade chemistry. And I thought, now that I've thought about this in this context, a good pretest for chemistry would be a proportional reasoning test, right? But would I see, that would be very good formative information for me. And it would, but if I gave kids a true chemistry test, they should score close to 0 on it. And so I have everybody starting at the same place. Is that the right thing? Oh, sorry. Yeah, so this is just a little exaggerated example from Jim Popham of the challenge of two different tests, right? I've set A, set B, and so if I was really smart about doing this and I was responsible for evaluating my own growth, I would do set A as my pretest and set B. It's 2-digit multiplication, right? And I look like a hero. And this is exaggerated, but it's you can see these kind of things. I don't know how many people are thinking about doing this, implementing a fall pretest and a spring post-test. The other thing I would say, though, is, and we were just having a conversation at the break, is there's a lot of information that you already have that you don't need to necessarily go digging for a new pretest. unless these kids are new to the school district, you have a whole lot of information about these kids from other things. The other challenge is, I joked that subtraction, now that we have vertical scale scores, subtractions became people's favorite numerical operation. And because I could subtract one score from the other, and it's pretty easy to do. The challenge is, and this is no fault of USBE, this is true for every vertical scale that I know. It's really hard to do this well and have this be meaningful. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But the problem is that once I subtract two scores and I have a different score, it has this implied precision that I have these scores came from some other authority. They must mean something, and if I subtract them, it must maintain that meaning. That paper that I cite there that several of us wrote, it required several of us because the first draft was mine and it was a rant, and so we decided we're going to publish it. It had to be actually tone it down a little bit. So the other sort of dirty truth of being a measurement professional is that we have to acknowledge that there's measurement error everywhere. Anybody who got on their bathroom scale this morning praised for measurement error in a certain direction, right? But we have it. It's there. As all sorts of lots of things. Did you have salt the night before or not, right? That's a form of measurement error because you're getting a measure doesn't actually reflect your true weight. It reflects the fact that you're holding in a little more water. It could be other things as well. So measurement error is in everything we measure. I drive my physician crazy when go in, annual physical, and you get these various. I ask things like silly things that's not measurement, like what's the standard deviation? I have no way of interpreting what that number means. Or what is the measurement error associated with this cholesterol test? And they just hate those questions, right? Because they got a number, and the number must be true, right? And so we see measurement error everywhere. Unfortunately, this is a sort of a truth, one of the true things we know in measurement. Error is uncorrelated with other error. So if I have error on test A and error on test B, they're not correlated. So what does that mean? What it means is that they're additive in a sense. They're compounded. The error gets compounded. So it's not like I could say, well, I have measurement error on test A and I have measurement error on test B, and they're going to sort of wash out. It's worse than that. It's this compounded error. And so that's something that you think about. That's why status measures, those of you who've looked at student growth percentiles, even at the kid level, and Center for Assessment invented student growth percentiles. My colleague Damien Biederbenner, they're open source. They're out on the R platform. But they have, when you look at the results at the kid level, from year to year, you see a fair amount of fluctuation. Way more fluctuation you see in scale scores of tests, because the status measures only have that measurement error at one point in time. And so you're not getting that compounded error. The other key thing is when we think about setting performance targets, like how much growth am I expecting? And this was common in early No Child Left Behind on certain things we were expecting, particularly in the safe harbor calculation. This is an age test for some of you who remember this stuff. We were often looking for small changes. And those small changes were a case of a signal easily getting lost in the noise. And so we would say, if you could allow us to actually have a 3-year trajectory, or for these AMOs, what we wanted to see, we actually could probably detect some signal through the noise because we're looking for bigger changes over a longer period of time. And so that's another thing to be thinking about if you're doing these smaller changes. I'm actually not going to. I'm going to skip over this. We can come back to this. This is just one little interesting case of just showing about the effect of measurement error. So if you just let's say we established a target for folks, a gain target, and we have a pretest score kid gets 60%, and the difference between 60% and 100% is 40%, and so the gain ultimate target is 80% correct. And we have a different pretest score, and we have the same approach. And so let's say we have 25 kids, and each of them just barely met their target by the skin of the teeth, but 100% of them met their target, okay? But not by much, right? But they did, if we knew truth. And so we would see that if all students, and we had truth, and right, 0 is the target, that's the deviation from the target. So if all of them right on the target, we're good, right? And we feel good, we've rewarded the teachers appropriately. But the reality is when you look at the effect of measurement error, and measurement error is always going to rear its ugly head much worse around cut scores, right? Because if somebody's really close, somebody's way above the cut, easy. Somebody's way below, easy. Somebody right on the cut, really hard. And so this is exaggerated a little bit, but this is what you see. Based on what we know about measurement error, we see that about a little more than a third of the kids, in this case, scored below the target on the post-test and observed scores. So we would say that they did not meet their target if we were giving a report back to the teacher. You can't do anything about that because you don't know truth, but what you do know is how to calculate these kind of standard errors and to say, when we set targets, maybe we should set a standard error around a target so we have some sense of, you're within the likelihood of being accurate, you're clearly above or clearly below. I'm going to skip through this, has made this point. So what about subtracting vertical scale scores? We have a vertical scale. That was a big push. So can I just subtract this year's scale score from last year's scale score? Yes, because you know math, so you can. And I would say at this kid level, it might be okay to do that. But you have to think about this. This is why we've actually moved to student growth percentiles. What if a parent, you know this from talking to parents, you say, your kid grew 50 points from last year to this year. What do you think the next question is? Right? What is it? Well, what did everybody else do? Right? Because these are just numbers. Right? They have no grounding, and and it's not a bad thing, right? But and so 50 points. I know that if my kid grew 40 points the year before, I think that 50 points is more than 40, and it might be, but I'm not sure. So reporting it with some context, it's going to get reported because the parents could do subtraction, and they have the multiple years on the reports, or they save the reports. But I will explain why I would argue it should never be done for aggregate growth, like characterizing teacher performance. So we would like to think of the difference between scores on a vertical scale like differences in temperature on a thermometer. And this is what we call the problem of intervals. So it was actually, it takes me back a few years, but I was part of a National Research Council project that wrote this book, The Value of Value-Added Scores, and we were actually trying to unpack this as it was becoming popular for teacher evaluation. And there were several of us researchers and academics and folks like me who bridged both worlds were meeting to sort of finalize one of the chapters. And this economist I was talking with this economist from Boston University. I said, well, we do have interval scales like temperature, right? The difference between, especially if I move off of the Fahrenheit scale, if I move to the, Kelvin scale or something like that, the difference between 10 degrees and 20 degrees is the same as the difference between 50 and 60 degrees. And if we translate that to the Fahrenheit scale, right, if we say the difference between 60 degrees and 70 degrees is the same as between 90 and 100, right? Everybody would say, yeah. He said, what if the thing you're trying to measure is comfort? Is it equal interval, right? And you think about that, and you say, barely notice it, if I'm outside, especially the difference between 60 and 70, but I'll certainly notice the difference between 90 and 100 in the summer. And so the point there is that the numbers on the vertical scale represent and trying to help us make inferences about what kids know and be able to do. Almost the equivalent of the comfort analogy in temperature. It's not, the numbers are not the thing. There's not a direct link that says, those of you remember your chemistry, right, that, you know, a degree Celsius is what it takes to heat. Where's Scott when I need him? 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius is 1 degree, you know, is the amount of energy it takes, right? And so we have that gold standard, if you will. We don't have that with scale scores on an assessment. They're all about inferences we make from these scores. So the point is, and if you want to have fun, you could go to a meeting of, you know, econometricians and statisticians and talk about interval scales. What's truly an interval, where you have these equal interval problems. So why does that make a difference? Why am I even harping on this? So we would like to think on the SAGE scale that the difference between 600 and 620 is the same as between 800 and 820. And what I like to remind people, people know of NWA MAP, right? Everybody knows of MAP, right? And I like those guys. But I joke with them even that they like to tout their vertical scale, their RIT scale, right? But I say even they don't believe the interval properties of their RIT scale. Because when they give a kid a growth target in the fall, it's not out of the, like everybody in the class should grow 5 RIT points. What do? They base it on where you start compared to kids who started at the same score fall of 3rd grade. And then they say, what was that median growth from fall to spring? And therefore, that becomes your target. So kids in a class will have different targets. Why? Because we know that it's not fully interval, and sometimes a gain of 5 points somewhere in the scale means more than a gain of 7 points somewhere else in the scale. Another way to think about this is, anybody watch the giant slalom last night? Michaela? So, right, if you think about that, if you take a kid and teach them, let's say a kid who's competent skier, but teach them how to do giant slalom, how to run gates, and they've never run gates before, you know, from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, they will improve their time by minutes potentially, right? And the difference between being on the podium and off the podium last night was less than a second, right? In a course that was over about a mile long, right? And so that you think about what that means is that is a minute a minute. And you know, if you're an elite skier, a minute is completely off the charts in terms of difference. Whereas if you're a beginning ski racer, the difference of a minute is negligible, right? So that's where we have to think about. So when you aggregate, and if your classes, if the achievement level of kids is not almost perfectly randomly distributed, and you have certain classes with lower performing kids or higher performing kids, not even by intention, just by random draw, then you will bias the results that certain teachers will look better than others, all things being equal, because they got kids who were the beginning ski racers and others got the experts, right? And that's just a fact of life. And it's so something that when we think about saying, I'm going to look at the average change of scale scores for the teachers in my class and the teachers in my school, and I'm going to give, I'm exaggerating, merit pay to those who had the highest 10% of gains. Well, I'm going to figure out, if I'm a teacher, where these scale score gains are most likely to be the best. It's not necessarily the lowest performing kids. It could be the highest. It could be the middle. Those are the kids I'm going to want to teach next year because I want to get that bonus. Right? It's not about how well I taught those kids. it's capitalizing on the non-interval nature of the scale. And again, I promise you that is not a problem with SAGE. I could show you every vertical scale that's used in the country. Because what people, and this is a long story, but what people really want with vertical scales is it's really adjacent grades is not bad. I'm thinking about kids. It's really saying if I had a kid in the 4th grade, this is a way for me to tell you how well that kid could have potentially performed on the 5th grade or 3rd grade test. It's not meant to stretch multiple grades. And it's definitely not meant for these aggregation purposes. So value-added models became all the rage about 10 years ago. It was Tom Kane at Harvard showed Bill Gates at the Gates Foundation some value-added models and showing these differences and effects, quote, affects teachers. And the reason why it's actually got called teacher effectiveness is because those of you remembering your statistics, when you think about complex sort of multi-level ANOVA calculations, you have effects, right? You have these various effects. And so they put a teacher variable in the equation, they get a teacher effect. And it's just leftover language, really, from statisticians and econometricians. That's why it got called teacher effectiveness through being pumped up by the Gates Foundation. Now, they're a very powerful evaluation tool. If you want to see if an intervention is working in your schools and you have the ability to calculate even a relatively simple value-added model or SGPs, it is a good way to help you get a sense of if I control for some factors like prior achievement, average achievement of the kids in the class, or some other things, it could help me figure out, I can't do, in education it's really hard to do random control trials. You can't assign kids usually to various teachers randomly. You can't assign them to receive a particular intervention and others not get the intervention, especially if you think the intervention is going to be positive for that kid. So that's an ethical challenge and an important one. So value-added models are an attempt to back us into that as a way to sort of produce a pseudo, like a quasi-experiment. So in its simplest case, right, I have the kids' scores in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. If I didn't, let's pretend I didn't have I was just basing this on 6th and 7th grade, then I was looking at the 8th grade score. The dashed line is how much they actually grew, but based on their prior achievement and perhaps some other factors, the dark line, the solid line, would be their expected growth. And you could see that in 7th grade, that little red dash, dotted lines, represents the amount that they beat their projection, right? It's like beating the point spread. And so they beat their point spread in 7th grade, and then again, they did so in 8th grade. And that is called the value-added estimate. That's theoretically what they refer to that as the value that the teacher or the school added to the kid, beyond what we would have predicted based on all this prior information. Now, what counts as prior information? Like I said, typically this previous scores, if you have multiple previous scores, so in this case, the 8th grade is based on prior scores in 7th and 6th grade. In the SGP stuff we do here, it's at least, if we could get 2 prior years, we use 2 prior years. I think we cap it at 3 in Utah, because once you get past 3, you're not getting much bang for your buck. And so that's another thing to talk about is the difference in reliability for either VAM or SGP from 1 prior score to 2 prior scores is remarkable. And you think about that, right? If I want to say, what's going to be my best estimate of somebody's performance and I have one prior observation or two, I think I'd take two almost every time, right? And so because one of them could be wrong, but you don't know that, and you don't know which one you're getting. So you add tremendously. Now, the difference between 1 and 2 prior observations is much greater than the difference between 2 and 3 prior observations. The third observation definitely helps. The prior observation adds reliability. That's a tough thing for locals if you're trying to do this pre-post stuff. Already went through this. Tough thing about value-added models, I don't know, years ago there's an article, it's in the New York Times, they showed a value-added formula. And those of you remember your regression classes. So just think of your regression equations like times 10, right? Just stretched out across the page. And they printed this on the headline of this article about this teacher who got a bad value-added estimate, but by every other description was an outstanding teacher. There's part of it was just the way the formula was operationalized, and she was disadvantaged. So the formula is very complex, and people don't see it as transparent. But in terms of robustness, value-added models offer a lot. Again, in an evaluation context, fabulous, and a lot of evaluators use them. Student growth percentiles is used here. This, I won't spend a ton of time on this because I think you're familiar with them. They're different than value-added, though, where value-added says, what's the predicted performance based on past? The student growth percentile says, based on kids like me, how well did I do this current year? And the picture is always better, right? Right, so we have this distribution of 2 tests. This is 2009, 2010. This distribution, right, generally fairly highly correlated. And student growth percentiles simply slice the distribution at the 1-year score. It's like a cake knife. And you do that for essentially every score. Or in this case, every percentile, 99 times. And so you keep slicing that distribution to say that now the kids who scored at 600 in 2009 are my academic peers. And in a case like Utah, where we have 35,000, 40,000 kids at a grade level, you have a lot of academic peers in your grade. For those of you who are interested in operationalizing student growth percentiles locally, we find that you usually need to have to do this with at least 1,000 to 1,500 kids. It's like the lower limit in the grade span to give you enough academic peers. And so again, so what do I say here? So I see what we're not just interested in the one score. So we have the kids who scored 600. Now I see this kid scored 650 in the next year, and I look at where that places that kid in that distribution. And they're at the 75th percentile of that distribution. So they're at the 75th percentile of their academic peers. That's good, right? Better than 50th percentile. And you do that all the way through the distribution. One of the challenges, this is true of value-added models as well, is it doesn't tell me, so a kid who's a very low-scoring kid could be in the 99th percentile, or the 1st percentile. A kid who's a very high-scoring kid could be in the 99th percentile or the 1st percentile. It just depends on how you compare to the kids in your academic peer group. So you have kids of different achievement levels getting the same or different student growth percentiles. Similarly, in the value-added world, you have kids of different achievement levels being shown to have beat or not beat their predicted scores. And so sometimes people find that frustrating. I think like all the highest performing kids should get growth percentiles of 99. Well, no, because they're sort of, in some cases, they're tied for first with 25 other kids. And so they're not. Typically, the way student growth percentiles are operationalized, the only prior information is previous achievement. It's not demographic factors or anything like that. That's a philosophical stance. It's not a fact of the computer program or anything like that. The nice thing about both value-added and student growth percentiles is they're not that highly correlated with status. And in fact, at the student level, they're uncorrelated. So it means that I can't predict a student's growth percentile based on their achievement level. And that's good because that gives me different information. At the school level, we do find there's some small correlation, but in the neighborhood of 0.2, whereas status from year to year is correlated about at the school level like 0.7 to 0.85. So, which is telling you it's basically the same thing. I'm going to move quickly. So what about those of us who can't use value added or student growth percentiles, and we really just have these two scores? What should we do? So I was an advisor to this project several years ago. Measure Progress was the lead organization on this. And it was in this notion of non-tested subjects and grades. This is a nice little document. I think we sent this out a while back. But so what if you can't use VAM or SGP? They went through a variety of approaches, and in this document, there's either a link to it or it's right in there, an Excel file for how to even set this up. And if you wanted to do some stuff locally, where you basically are a very simple regression approach. So you have an end-of-year summative assessment. You have a predictor test or combination, multiple predictors, so it's multiple regression. And they have a very nice Excel file to walk you through this. And it truly is the most simple case of value-added model, where you just have in this simple linear regression format, and you basically say, if I look at the student's predicted score and their actual score, if they're above the line, that's right, remember regression, if they're above the line, that's good. If they're below the line, not so good. And so this is a very simple case of how you could do this. But we always have this question, how much is enough, right? How much growth is enough? And so we've actually thought it was helpful, certainly at school levels, and you see this on a lot of the plots, is to look at the combination of growth and achievement, right? Where do you want your schools to be? You want them in the high, right? We have certain schools that happen to be blessed by their location, and they have high achievement and not such great growth, right? We have schools that are not as blessed as their location, but they're still producing high growth. Those are effective schools. That's Dale's Quadrant C. We want to see that. Now, you want to see that over time, and you think that they will, if they do that over time, they will rise up. They will become more effective. And these are the schools, and a lot of what we set up for comprehensive support and improvement under ESSA are these kinds of schools, as these low growth, low achievement. Just wrapping up here. So, like I said, this attribution stuff is the hardest. And they lead to, so I have a friend, Henry Brown, that's very well known in this field. I teased him this. He showed me this is like his Rube Goldberg, machine. But in some sense, it is like this, right? We have these data sources, test scores, right? We have these analytic engines, whether they're VAM or SGPs or something else, and then we classify them. Somebody asked, they're like, well, is 50 good or not good, right? That's a classification decision. We say, well, we've said it here, above 50 is good, or, things like that. And then we have how their current classification is. But in this case, we have these indicators, these classifications. What do we attribute that to? So some folks have said to me, can't you do SGPs from 8th grade, let's say SAGE, to 11th grade ACT? Yeah, we can. The computer doesn't care that there's a space of 3 years. What you have there, though, is who do you attribute that score to? You attribute it to the whole school? And what about schools that we have churn year to year anyway? So any 5th to 6th grade or 6th to 7th, we know we have some kids leaving, others. But now you magnify that by 3 years, and you know that churn is worse in a lot of other schools. And so the computer, like I said, the computer never cares about this stuff. The numbers will be the numbers. It's up to you to make sense of, and I used to use this example when people would talk about Like, who gets credit for the math score or the reading score? If schools are doing their job, hopefully the kids are learning some reading and writing and social studies and science. Or is it all the ELA teacher? Or they're working on some math stuff in science. Sometimes there's, a kid gets a tutor or something like that. There's this variety of ways. So this attribution thing, who owns that score and should they really own the whole thing, is an important decision. Last slide. So be very clear about what you're trying to do and why you think it's going to make a difference. And think about unintended negative consequences. Some of you who've been around long enough remember Rich Hill, who did some work. He founded the center. I used to joke that it's a good thing he devoted his life to good, because he used to think of all these ways to corrupt the systems. And it was helpful for us as we would build accountability systems, because they're going to be corrupted. And this is the sort of fun, right? It's people want to rush to evaluation. And I'm a judgmental person, so I understand that, right? But let's not rush to evaluation. We have to be able to describe what we're seeing first, then we think about the inferences we're making, and finally we make judgments about it. So I know that was a little long. You could always write to me for more stuff, but we have some time for questions. I know that was fast and a lot. But you have the slides. Kim. Yeah, so Kim asked, how does this apply to writing tests where we don't have a solid right or wrong? So again, the computer doesn't care, right? Because you're going to score the writing test according to a rubric, and whether it's a 6-point rubric or there's multiple dimensions and raters, and you get a certain number of points, and then it's essentially you have to validate that the scores are sensible. But then you could say, if I wanted to look at, in the simplest case, this is a little bit of a gross scale, I take all the kids who scored 3 on the writing test in the fall, assuming they scored 3 for similar reasons, but that's a different story. Let's say I take all the kids who scored 3, and I see how they performed on a writing test next year or something like that. That would be the sort of the poorest man's SGP, right? And saying how they do. Some kids will score 1, some kids will score 6. You hope that most of them move up a little bit. And we've done similar things like that. I didn't talk about this transition tables. If you would have given me 2 more hours, but you could tell I could talk about this for a long time. But another thing we've done is just simply transition tables for something like a simple scale like that. Is you just do like a matrix of 6 by 6 matrix, and you say kids who scored a 3 in year 1, where'd they end up in year 2? And you put it, you put a little X by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you could see these transitions. Think about any single writing test. You understand that there's going to be a fair amount of unreliability in that. That's not a fault of the writing test. That's the problem of one. But that was a good question, because you could use it for anything. Robert, what do you think?
I think that it's very helpful having your support. We've made a change. I repeat, we appreciate the support of the Center for Assessment. We made a big conceptual change on ours. Originally, we were thinking we would use a difference between pre-post and then compare between years. And we've measured the z-scores on those, and then just the post tests. The z-scores were really wide, got values as high as 5. And if we use only the post tests for comparison, we get far better ranges on our z-scores. The other thing is, I think that you've helped us solidify the idea that we are doing this as a comparison, see if there are areas that we can reward and others that we need to work with.
So I wasn't looking for an endorsement, but it was because I know that he's been thinking about it a lot. And again, I hope that, and I think they are in Granite, is that you want to use additional information, lots of additional information before you make these decisions about rewarding. Other questions? questions? Any questions online? Or we must have got to all the questions that were coming into Kim earlier. So, oh, not looking for praise. Just my information's here. I'm here a lot, and so if you have questions, email me. And we work very closely with Anne Michelle's group and Randy's group and the folks doing the SGP calculations here, and we're doing all sorts of other stuff. But these questions are big ones, and they're just not easy answers to any of them. And so the last take-home message about teacher evaluation is I joke that for years people tried to do curriculum, teacher-proof curriculum. And we tried to do teacher evaluation as principal-proof teacher evaluation for many years, instead of like building the skills of the principals to really become, and using data. I'm committed that we need to use student performance data in teacher evaluations, but how is the trick. It's time for lunch. Darren, you want to say anything else? Thanks.